Okay, welcome back to English 491, History of the English Language. In this video lecture, or a series of lectures, depending on how long this one goes, we will be discussing the historical context for the emergence and separation of Old English and the Old English period based on what we know. Now, the Old English period is also sometimes called the Anglo-Saxon period, for reasons we'll discuss, and this here is a helmet that survives from this period, from a burial mound. First thing, though, about Old English, though, just as we get into our subject this week, is as difficult as it strikes us, Old English is English. So the word for youth is yeoguth, and you could see how there's been a gradual change of that word, but there's a recognizable connection between that word, the etymon, Geoguth, and the reflex youth. Son is sunu. Daughter is dochtor. Friend is freond. Home is ham. Now, ground is an interesting one, because we have the word grund, which means very simply ground, but we have a bunch of other words that also can be used to mean ground, including eartha, folda, hruza, theolo, emnet, and floor. Now, which of these do you recognize as having modern English versions? Well, earth, I think, is most obviously one, and floor. But what about the other ones? The one I can tell you is theolu, which is related to the modern word fallow, field that's left unplanted, left to grow wild. So there's a lot of lexicon that's in common. The word like is an interesting one. It goes back to an adjective, yelik, which means similar, right? And a verb, yelikion, which means to resemble. And it's also related to this interesting compound word, likham, which is body home. And this lik, or lich, as it might have been pronounced in some dialects, means body or corpse. And if any of you are fantasy gamers, you might recognize a connection to lich there. So that's the word like. And to be like something is to resemble it in body, to have a body that's like it. Love, Old English is luvu in the noun, and the verb is luvion. So this is just a taste of the word set of the Old English language, where there's a lot in common, but there are words that have fallen out of use as well. Now, most of the Old English that survives to us, or much of it, especially the kind that literary scholars pay attention to, is what might be called a prestige form. That is, it was a written language, and therefore it was a formal kind of highfalutin language, not necessarily the everyday form of the language that people might have spoken. So if your familiarity with the Old English is only from Beowulf, that's like your only familiarity with regular English being Shakespeare, especially given that the manuscript that survives of Beowulf from around 1000 maybe centuries newer than the poem itself. So here's just an example of the language, this formal poetic language of the Old English people. Hey Guthkinning, over Swanrada, Sitchian Wulda, Marna Theoden, Thahim Was Manatherf, Don Sithvat him Snotera Cherels. Lit Juan Logan, Vea he him leofwara hueton hierofna hail shaudan. Now, if you read in Learer, you'll see some of the features that he talks about in the Old English poetic language. The existence of these compound words, the alliterative pattern linking the first and second half of each verse line together, and so on and so forth. We'll also see these characters that are no longer used, that the F and the thorn, which both have a th sound or a the sound, depending on where they are in a word. And SC, remember, is sh, and an H before a W is hua, hueton. And so Other than that, the vowels are often pronounced like they would be in German or Spanish. They're the continental vowel good system. So it's not he guthkinning, it's hey guthkinning. A U always has a U quality. And an E has an A quality. So this is just a little taste of Old English. He, the war king, over the swan road to seek, wished that mighty clan chief, Theoden. Any Tolkien fans might recognize the name Theoden, which meant a king or a chief. That mighty clan chief, Maerna Theoden, Tha, him, well that looks modern, was, well I connect that with was, Mana Therf, there was of men need. So the syntax is a little different, and part of this is because of the features of Old English nouns, including cases, which we talked a little bit about last week, and I will talk about more in a subsequent video. Just a little taste for you. In this video, though, I would just want to talk a little bit more about Old English culture and the place of the language in Old English society and how we know what we know about it. Some of it comes from texts and manuscripts. We also have other kinds of things that survive, such as material goods, runic inscriptions on stone crosses. Pictured here is a gold armband or a torque that was in what the recently discovered Staffordshire hoard. The Old English, the Anglo-Saxon, the pre-Christian Germanic people that they were in they had the custom of burying treasures with important people, and this is something we see in a great deal of cultures, and definitely in Indo-European cultures going way back. But wait, that's not Old English on that torque. What's that say there? It says Surge Domine, and DNA is like an abbreviation. Dissipentur inimici et fugiant qui oderunt. That's Latin. This thing has Latin on it. It's saying, "Rise up, Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and those who hate you be driven from your face." Now, why would an Old English a warrior have Latin on their armband? Well, for one thing, Latin was a language, even though the Roman Empire had, in the West, the Latin-speaking empire had fallen. It lived on in the East as what we call the Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking portion. But even though the Latin-speaking Roman Empire had disintegrated, well, the Latin language itself still enjoyed a great deal of prestige. It was the language of learning, it was the language of education, and most importantly at this point, it was the language of the Christian church. And the Old English peoples began Christianizing from around the 5th century, the 6th century on, through the mission work of monks from both Ireland, and the Celtic parts of the British Islands, where the Christian religion had continued to be cultivated and worshipped, and from the community of Christians centered around the Bishop's See in Rome, the early papacy. And so what we have in the years from 600, 700, 800, 900, 1000, is a condition of diglossia. This is an important word you're going to need to know for this class, and later triglossia. Diglossia is a situation in which two languages or two varieties of the same language are used under different conditions within a community, often by the same speakers. Now, this happens frequently for a number of reasons. I have observed students from foreign countries who, when they're talking about their home life or personal life or social plans, will talk in their mother language, be it Chinese or Persian or what have you. And then when they start talking about their homework that they have for a university class, they will switch to English, the language of education. In North America. And so diglossia is this kind of situation. It's where you have more than one language being spoken, but they're not freely interchangeable. They're used for different purposes in different situations, and sometimes they vary in prestige. Prestige is the level of regard normally accorded to specific language or dialect within a speech community relative to other languages or dialects. And this is a major concept that is going to organize a lot of our understanding of English and its use and its changes and the various kinds of English over the many centuries between the burying of the Staffordshire Hoard and today. Now, a lot of what we know about the Old English period is because of this dude right here. His name is Bede. He was a monk. He lived from 673 to 735 CE, and he was a monk at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow in I think Northumbria, which we'll talk about. And he was the author of many theological works and biblical commentaries. He's considered one of the great doctors of the church. Doctor is, of course, a Latin word meaning teacher. And he wrote a great many different kinds of things that were important for the medieval church. But he's known to modern historians largely, and the general educated public, largely because he was the author of a book known in English as the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and this was completed in 731. And it is our largest and seems to be the most complete and accurate account of how, sometime from 400 on, the Germanic-speaking peoples, various tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, migrated, took over, sometimes cooperated with, and sometimes fought against the Celtic-speaking Britons and Romano-Britons who were there. Now, there are limits to the usefulness of this text. It is not a painstaking, scientific, I'm going to tell you everything that happened exactly as it happened. It's a selective and dramatic retelling of history as he knew it. He was also depending on oral sources himself, and though he wrote in Latin, but his purpose was to illustrate God's providence, that God had a plan for England, and that he had a plan to redeem the English and the Anglo and Saxon people. There's a story that he tells about how Pope Gregory the Great was walking in a market in Rome with his friend, and they go to the slave market, as you do, I guess, and they see a beautiful boy, and he says to his friend, "Hey, what kind of person is that?" And he says, "Oh, that's an Angle," and he says, "Oh, non Angli sed angeli," not an angle, but an angel. He's so pretty. And then he asks where he's from, and he says, he's from the country of Deira. Oh, then they will be saved Deira from the wrath of God. And what's the king of that land? Allah. Alleluia for this day, and so on and so forth. So, well, a lot of puns. And anyway, he ends up sending an Augustine, a different Augustine than the one you've usually heard of probably, to set up a mission, and they set up what became the church in Canterbury. And so this is the story of the church in England, but he also ends up telling about all the wars and tribes and nations and various kingdoms of England. That's part of the story. So he's a doctor of the church, only one of 36, including Jerome, Augustine, and Aquinas, great Latin writer and teacher, and a super important source. He is, of course, our source for Cadman's hymn, which is mentioned in chapter 2, I believe, of Learer's Inventing English. So confer with that. Now, before the Angles and Saxons got there, Britain was inhabited. It had been there inhabited for a long time. We have records of people in prehistoric Britain going back to 50,000 BCE. And we don't know much about the people before them, but there was, a European population of Homo sapiens back to 50,000 BC. And this is called the Neolithic or New Stone Age, because there's, some limited farming going on and complex material culture. This is a genetic reconstruction of the face of the people who would have lived there. Some of them are preserved in bogs quite well. We have, paleoanthropological evidence. These are the people who built Stonehenge. Stonehenge and various other henges had been built in not just in Britain, but in Ireland and in parts of France. I guess I don't know that much about my henges, but they were all over Western Europe, and they were part of a people that was there before the first Indo-Europeans got there. When the Indo-Europeans got there, they were very successful in part because they were an Iron Age people defeating a Bronze Age people, and they also had larger, more organized agriculture, domestication of animals. They had, as Indo-Europeans, we talked about this last week, they had horses and charts, and this is a sort of artist depiction of what early Celts might have looked like. This might be a little bit romanticized. I don't think they had tartan pants, but they did have these round houses because we have archaeological evidence of that. These pictures, I think, are based on the accounts of contemporaries. So Iron Age Celtic Britain this is the British culture, the Indo-European culture that ruled a lot of Western Europe. They were related to the Gauls conquered by Caesar, and the Portugal. They were in Iberia. Portugal comes from a word meaning the port of the Gauls, or the word Gaul is related to Celt. You can see that the Gaul versus the K as an instance of Grimm's Law, actually. Now, what happens in the 1st century CE? Well, the Romans always show up to the party and kind of just do their Roman thing. There's a famous picture of Caesar's famous expedition to the British Islands, described in his Roman Wars, and the chariot riding Britons led by their queen. Actually, Boadicea later, but they're coming to meet him on the beach and fight him. But the Romans eventually, it's almost 100 years after Caesar, but then Caesar gets his butt kicked by the Celtic Britons and has to go back to Gaul because there's an uprising there. And it's not for a good century later till the Romans come back. But come back they do, and they end up colonizing and taking over much of Britain. But they don't go all the way up into what is now Scotland. They never succeed in conquering beyond that, and they end up building these fortified walls that still survive today. I think George Martin took some inspiration. And what the Romans did is wherever they did, they built little Romes. So in old Roman Britain, they had theaters and bathhouses and temples to their pagan gods and so on and so forth. And they sort of set up these little colonies. And it's very likely that Latin would have only been spoken in official capacities and in the towns and in trade and worship. And out in the countryside, the peasants who were farming and raising the food and doing other things would still have been spoken Celtic. So it's very likely we would have had a situation of diglossy. All right, that's enough for this video. In the next video, we'll come to the end of the Romano-Celtic period and into the what's called the Anglo-Saxon period, and we'll learn more about Anglo-Saxon culture and who they were and how they may or may not have interacted with the Celts whose land they were invading.